Okay, welcome everybody. It is Senate Education, May 14th, 2020, continuing our remote sessions. And thank you to our guests today, Norm Etkin, Jessica Careless, and Eric Philcorn. We have two topics that we're going to be toggling back and forth between. The first has to do with a discussion we began last time about the House Bill H209 and school construction. That bill, if you will remember, sought to get the wheels turning again slowly toward involving the state in capital outlay and assistance for school construction. And so we're going to be talking with Mr. Etkin and Mr. Philcorn about that. Jessica Careless will be part of the second topic, which has to do with adult learning and standardized testing required by, I believe it's June 1st, in order to maintain their funding. So there are questions about that population being required to test in person when the trend for K through 12 students is going the other way. That is K through 12 students who are not adults. So let's start with the first topic, and that goes back to H209 and state aid for school construction. So why don't we start? Why don't we start with Eric Philcorn, BGS, and the first question, Eric, would be, to what extent has BGS testified on the House bill? What is its view of the House bill? And if you haven't testified on the House bill, do you know enough about the general parameters to speak to it?
For the record, Eric Philcorn, Buildings and General Services. I backbenched the House bill a bit. We were called in to offer sort of technical / historical information on how facilities condition assessments worked. And Alice Emmons actually offered a lot of the testimony on the history of school construction funding and how the bonding worked in the past. Long ago, BGS was involved in that work, but it's been many years, and the people who did work on it are no longer there. So our lane was fairly narrow.
Okay, and Senator Perchlik, am I right in summarizing that part of the reason you wanted BGS brought in on the discussion was you thought they, in some future iteration of a construction program, that they might manage that?
Yeah, that's my idea. They're not too keen on the idea, I found out. But the other point for BGS is they're listed as one of the entities that's going to work with AOE and board to come up with new building standards for schools. And then the commissioners mentioned again later. So they're going to be involved. And you know what BGS says is what I think anybody's going to say is, well, they don't have the staff or the capacity to do all the work here, and that's why the bill wants to hire a consultant for the $1 million. But in my personal view, BGS is kind of a victim of their own success in that they're good at this. And so if we were going to try to give resources to somebody to do this, in my view, it makes more sense for it to be BGS. But you know, setting aside that future discussion about who would do the work or who has more capacity than who, it would be good just to hear what they think their role would be as far as helping design the standards and what they think of the bill and their involvement in it now.
Eric, you want to pick that up?
Mr. Chairman, one of the main reasons that we were involved in the conversation as this was being developed is because we had, for the past 5 years, been through a contractor conducting facility condition assessments of all state buildings. So we do 20% of our building stock every year, and that is from the roof down to the septic field. And we spend close to that amount, or at least, I guess, actually a little less than $1 million over the 5 years, but with the way the industry's inflating, the last round of estimates that we got for RFP was actually in the neighborhood of $1 million. So what happens is we retain a firm, and they go out and they look at the buildings top to bottom, they measure the walls, they do a really thorough assessment of the structure, the systems, all aspects. I mean, it can get really granular on a garage. It's amazing, these reports. And our involvement in the actual assessment process is simply having one of our maintenance staff on hand to walk them through the building and make sure they can open all the closet doors and get to what they need to get to. And so the reason that we were pulled into this was in large part because we've recently gone through the process of an RFP for a facilities condition assessment. We don't really have expertise in-house anymore around school buildings. I mean, you'll find, state colleges have their own facilities people that deal with their buildings, and we have, some involvement, but we're really not experts in schools. I think when we did have a program that was involved in schools, I think it was Wanda Manoli who was actually the schools person, but she's now at DMV. So we were really, and we were careful not to commit our resources to this because we don't have them, but we were delighted to help education in developing their RFP and walking them through that process and being kind of a technical support resource. That was something we were comfortable with. And, we were not, what am I trying to say? We were not taking a position on the bill. We just wanted to make sure that if they did it, they had us as a resource to make sure that they did it right.
So was Senator Perchlik's characterization of BGS's position more or less correct, that you'd prefer not to be tasked with management of anything like this in the future?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that, there won't be some zombie effect where it continues to come up onto your radar screen, but
it could become a perennial. There's no doubt about it. Right?
So noted. Yeah, Senator Perchlik.
So Eric, in that, I think it's the first section, in section 1, it talks about the commissioner of BGS shall be a consultant to the Secretary of Education to update the school construction facility standards. And I think that's something that when we talked about this on Tuesday, we were going to get sent to us. I don't know, I haven't seen that, but how do you feel that BGS would consult on that thing to AOE?
I think our involvement in that might be some technical review, but when you talk about standards for education, you're really talking about space standards for delivering services. I mean, one of the things they were talking about in the testimony that I heard was that, yes, they have school counselors working in broom closets adjacent to gymnasiums. Is that an approach? So those kinds of assessments, we're not really qualified to deal with, but we know a bad roof when we see one. So I think that would be.
So just to clarify, BGS doesn't oppose that provision, the advise and consent provision, call it. Not consent, but advice.
Well, yeah, and I think there are two places where BGS has knowledge that is helpful in shepherding them through the process, because the Office of Purchasing and Contracting is part of BGS. And so when it comes to just helping with the process of an RFP, that's great, we can do that. And then, at a high level, looking at what's being accounted for in the broad strokes of an RFP for anything that involves structures, electrical grid, that kind of thing. We have some experience there and we know what to look out for. But I think programming is going to be a big part of this assessment. Is the building not just structurally sound, but appropriate for the use.
Mhm, mhm.
And that's where we're definitely not.
Understood. Senator Hardy.
Yeah, thank you. One of our conversations on Tuesday was about some potentially immediate needs of school districts in the context of the COVID crisis. And they may have some health and safety issues with their facilities that they've known about, but are even more urgent now that they're going to have to bring kids back or hope to bring kids back to school during a pandemic. And I'm thinking of things like air filter systems and some of the things that you actually may have expertise in, because they're not necessarily directly related to the ability to use a space for education, but rather the ability for a space to be safe for human beings to be in during a pandemic. And wondered if there are some shovel ready or really easy to get off the ground kinds of projects in some of our schools that are urgent, if BGS might be able to play a role in getting those done on the sooner side.
Our project management staff is full, they're all completely engaged in projects like the secure residential facility, the corrections projects. There's not really a lot of room to spare, especially if you're taking people off their regular work to do this kind of stuff. I mean, I think a lot of it probably could be handled at the district level. When the schools were coming in to present what I saw in committee, again as a backbencher, they were showing poster boards of raw sewage in basements and some really emergent things up in the kingdom and elsewhere. When we do HVAC projects, we usually go and hire a contractor to do an HVAC project. Like you'll see one in the Capitol bill for the State House, hopefully.
Mhm. Yeah, I was going to say, I think our testimony was that all work had to be completed by December 30th in order to qualify for CARES funding.
Yeah, that was a tough one for us too, because Alice Emmons and her committee came to us to see if anything in the current Capitol bill could potentially be spun out to CARES Act. And the problem for us is that we have a pretty long process of design and schematic design and scope. There are all these layers that we didn't have anything on our docket that we could possibly get out the door and paid for before the deadline was up. We even looked at the State House project to see if maybe it could fit, but it just wasn't possible.
Well, that's to your point. It seems as though the only things that could possibly work in this timeline would be if a district had already identified the HVAC system. They had already gone through the process of, looking for a contractor, and because now you can't even be sure that you'll be able to get people to physically show up to perform the work.
Right, and then CARES Act, I believe on the other bookend, there's a December 31st completion, but then there's this project could not have been on the books before COVID. So it's
right.
I think mitigation work, splash guards, and putting hand sanitizer in the right places. Those are really the kinds of projects that Vermont can get done, preparing for a school year. I think that's more reasonable.
Senator Perchley.
Just let the committee know, I think we're going to hear from Norm Etkin on this. He has some thoughts on this very topic.
All right, why don't we switch over to Mr. Etkin? Thanks for joining us, Mr. Etkin. And feel free to comment on the discussion from whatever angle you like. We understand you have experience in the energy side of this. And I believe you're muted. Now you're not.
I should be unmuted now.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, I'm here. All right. Let's see. So perhaps I should just give a brief introduction as to who I am and what I've done, just so that you understand, if that's okay. Yeah, I've actually worked in the area of school energy and visiting and auditing school buildings for a total of 18 years. 12 of them at the Superintendent's Association, running the school energy program there. And I've been top to bottom at 501 school buildings in Vermont, in 341 schools, both private and public schools. So I have a really thorough understanding of just what we have for schools. And right now you're asking about the COVID issues, and in particular asking somewhat about CARES Act projects and what can happen. First of all, I have to say that the most important thing really for schools as they look to open up this fall would be to make sure all the ventilation systems are working correctly. Because as Dr. Levine said yesterday at the news conference, there have been recent studies that showed and demonstrated in detail exactly the difference between areas covered by ventilation and areas that weren't in terms of transmission of the disease. When I started doing these energy assessments, I quickly realized there were issues there, and I got hold of a CO2 meter. So I was always checking ventilation effectiveness in all the schools, and it varies greatly. A lot of schools have made significant improvements since I started in those systems, but there's a lot left to do. Also, there's a lot, there needs to be some increased understanding of what type of modifications may want to happen to ventilation systems because of COVID-19 and how they should operate. I've suggested that a task force be created to look into just what those changes might be, and to make sure that all schools are inspected and make sure that all the systems are working correctly. And it includes everything from making sure that you have the correct filters, that they're properly installed, that the hours of operation and the controls are working correctly, and so on. And to your point, Mr. Chairman, about what might be kind of shovel ready, a lot of schools do have projects that are shovel ready. A lot of things that they've wanted to do that they've had engineers involved in to see what can be done to make sure their systems are working correctly. And perhaps they didn't have the money to implement them. So if there's a possibility of getting some CARES Act funding to help schools, in some cases they may need to replace a unit ventilator, let's say, or which are just maybe about $8,000 to $10,000 right there. There are issues like that in some schools that they just haven't had the money to do that kind of work. Most schools do have contractors in during the summer to do maintenance work on their HVAC systems. So I think it's entirely conceivable that they can, and for that matter, I would say that they must go ahead and make sure all those systems are working correctly before students arrive. The last thing we want to have happen is to have schools open up and then have some incidents of an infection that can be traced back to improper ventilation. So I think that's a very important piece, and it'd be a great thing if something could be done about that.
Absolutely. And I will make a note to schedule that for a future meeting. It would be great to have a policy developed by AOE, and maybe in conjunction with the superintendents, specifically around ventilation. And I haven't had fine-grained enough discussions with the administration to know to what extent, and this will speak to our conversation with Mr. Careless too, to what extent they are pushing different entities to apply for money. So in the case of Just a Careless, we're going to be talking about adult learning. And one of the problems there is that some of those adult learning centers don't have the technology for online standardized testing. This would be a great opportunity, it seems, to get that for them and to, if possible, defray the costs with COVID money. Similarly, with the ventilation systems, that's something that we've had perennial problems with in Vermont. We dealt with it in Burlington. there was I forget what they call it, but a mini spike, a statistical spike in illness that they were tentatively tracing to bad air circulation. So it's something that we should be on, and AOE should have a policy, an immediate policy to get that money if possible. So I'll make a note of that. Anything else you'd like to tell us, Mr. Aitken?
Well, the COVID piece was just one thing that just came up. Of course, there's the whole issue of school facilities and construction aid and so forth. And so I've got quite a few comments on them. If you'd like for me to go there, Mr. Chairman.
Please keep going.
Okay, I'll keep going. I should mention that, in addition to the energy work, I also was a project development consultant working with nonprofit organizations developing community projects as well as housing projects and so on. So I'm familiar with developing projects as well. And I've seen, as I mentioned, I've seen all those school buildings. There are tremendous needs out there. I don't think there's any question, and I'm sure you've heard some of the estimates going up to $1 billion worth of needs in the schools. That's just to correct deficiencies more than to establish new schools or new buildings. I can't say one way or another about that number, except to say that it wouldn't surprise me if the actual number was somewhere in that neighborhood. And that's, there's a lot of issues there in terms of deferred maintenance and ADA compliance and, regular capital replacements as well as energy replacements and improvements. And then there's also modernization to meet current needs. So there's a lot there. And I think there is a certain amount of state responsibility for our schools in terms of, I think, the Brigham decision did kind of establish the responsibility to provide equal educational opportunity. And it's hard to get that if you don't have a decent school building to work with. And some schools really don't. We also have great schools and great management, and we also have some very, very bad schools. And there's a couple different issues that kind of get conflated here. There's the whole issue of construction aid and, the suspension that's been in effect since 2007, the need for data and planning, and the need for, setting some kind of standards. But these things are not mutually exclusive. I'd like to suggest that, it's really a tragedy that there is not construction aid currently. I think you're getting my opinion here, of course, and I only represent myself now. I'm not employed by any people at all at the moment. I think it's important to reinstate construction aid, and now, while you figure the rest of this out. Now, I think there's several ways that can be done. Of course, I used to appear before then Senator Scott and when he chaired Institutions Committee every year to go over the needs and so forth for that program. And it was very, very important to schools to have that there, both because it's very difficult for schools to do projects. That's something to understand, that they have a short construction season, primarily over summer. They have to go through several steps and approvals and so on. It's a very difficult process for them, and they need some incentives to help this along. Now, I believe it. It may be difficult to get construction aid into the capital bill, especially now with so many needs. But I think, and I did suggest a way that may be easier to deal with this in terms of funding. So I'll throw it out there just as another something for you to think about, perhaps. In the calculation for per student cost, there, one of the elements there is going to be amortization of debt.
Could you, your voice cut out there. Could you start that sentence again?
Oh, okay. My microphone's supposed to work good, but yeah, so I'm happy to. There is a way through the regular way that per student cost is calculated to provide construction aid. And so it's a rather simple thing, but but nothing in education is simple. You probably know that better than I do. But the in the calculation for per student cost, one of the elements is the amortization of, bonded indebtedness for construction projects. If you included, if you wanted to provide 30% construction aid, if you only included 70% of that cost, as opposed to 100% of that cost in that calculation for per student cost, then you would be providing that 30% construction aid essentially as a subsidy toward that amortization. So that would reduce the per student cost for that district. So it would provide an incentive. Of course, the rest of that cost would get picked up by the Ed Fund. But it's a way, this would come on slowly as projects come online and so on. So there'd be plenty of time to deal with any issues around the Ed Fund that this might create. But I'm just saying it's one method that where you could provide the construction aid without dealing with bonding and all the competition within, the capital bill. So
Could
it's
I
just,
ask,
yeah.
could I ask Mr. Etkin that you put this down in a one pager and send it to us?
Well, sure.
Because it sounds like an interesting idea, but it's complex, clearly.
Yeah.
And I don't want to make a clumsy note and not capture what you're actually talking about. So it'd be great
Sure.
if you could just send us an email to, do you have Jeannie's email?
Yeah, I've got Danny's, and yes, I have.
Okay, great. And then she will disperse it out to the rest of us.
Yeah, it is, obviously the formulas are complicated, but the basic there is just that there's a way of providing the construction aid through that calculation of per student cost, and do it that way. And that would provide that incentive without bonding and going through the capital bill. So I just want to throw that out there. Next, I would say that as you look to trying to figure out just what the needs are in the schools, I should mention that, there is no requirement for what a school is in Vermont. And as you look to hire a contractor to see what work is necessary, I think it's incumbent upon us all really to have certain minimum standards in Vermont for what a school is. And then part of the analysis of what's needed would be what is the cost to bring schools up to that minimum standard, and perhaps later a better standard than just the minimum in terms of providing a good educational environment in the facilities. So it's just another idea. I think there are some schools that really should not have kids in them, and there's no inspection in that regard. There's no review like that takes place. I think there should be minimum standards. There should be licensing of the schools. There should be inspection of the schools to make sure they meet the minimum standards, given some time to improve them, to bring them up to those standards. And I think it's incumbent on the state to make sure the funding is available for that to be able to happen and have at least schools meet a minimum standard. So you're getting my thoughts on this. I'm giving you plenty. So as to, let me see if my notes here. In looking at the whole situation here, to make everything, to deal with the issue of facilities and schools, AOE used to have Kathy Hilgendorf there that ran the school program. She did an excellent job. Right now, as far as I know, there isn't a staff person there that has a specific responsibility to deal with school facilities. Perhaps I'm wrong. Last I heard there wasn't. But you're asking for a lot of things to happen in this bill, and who's going to do it? The Board of Education does not have staff, as far as I know. The AOE has no staff that can work on this, as far as I know. So if you want this to happen, someone with with some experience working on this stuff really needs to be available there to make it happen. Oh, so, looking, if you'd like, I can look at some of the specifics around your version of H209 and a few comments on that. I am not hearing you.
You're muted, Senator Bruce.
We do have this other topic to pick up at about 3:30. So why don't we give you another 5 minutes to make specifics about the bill, then 5 minutes for questions, and then we'll move to Mr. Careless.
Okay, well, let me take a quick look here. I think I'm probably more interested in your questions and trying to answer them than my comments on H209, which I can get you. But I think obviously the long delay there would mean that you're not in a position to really address this for several years. It's really essentially kicking the can down the road. We're well aware of what the problems are, especially the whole section 2, which is, let's see, take a quick look here. So maybe that's section 3. Although section 3 there, I think you really have enough information now to bring up the issues in section 3. We know there's a lot of need. The question is, how are you going to address it? It's always best to have better data, but that's not the real issue here. The real issue is, how are we going to address what everyone recognizes as significant needs? So that's that. I'll let it rest there, and if there are some questions, I'd be happy to try to answer it, and I will certainly get you something in writing to explain what I mean. I can also show you the actual spreadsheet that the business managers use in that calculation and where that would come into play.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Senator Hardy.
Yep. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Etkin, for your testimony. I have 2 questions, and one is, you mentioned that the state doesn't have standards for school buildings, and I'm wondering, are there outside entities that do? And the reason I ask is because the story told in my town is that we had to make major renovations to our high school building, gosh, I think 30 years ago now, because it was going to lose accreditation. And I'm wondering, is that an actual thing, or is this an urban myth or a small town myth?
I'd have to first say I'm not too familiar with all the accreditation requirements and so forth. I'm not sure that accreditation is actually required, and I could be wrong about that. You have someone there from Agency of Education. They might be able to address that part of the question. What I'm talking about is the state does not have any standard for what a school is, or any requirement for what a school is, and doesn't license them in that regard.
Right. Yes. I mean, and your point is very well taken there. I think it's a problem, because you're right that some school buildings are lovely and wonderful, and others are really, really sad and not appropriate for kids. I want to make sure I understand, you were saying when you were looking at section 2 and 3 of the bill, as the House has laid it out, would hire a consultant to gather a bunch of information and pay that person quite a bit of money. And I think that much of the information that consultant would collect is actually already available at the local level, because schools know their buildings quite well. And I'm wondering if is that what you were saying, that if we just ask the schools, or do you think it's not available?
It's not available.
It's not available.
Not in the way. If you're going to try to establish a program based on data that you're going to get from a report like that, it has to be some type of uniform analysis. And therefore, like I was saying, if we create a minimum standard for what a school is, that would be one evaluation that would be done across the board. What does it take to bring all our schools up to that minimum standard, and then perhaps additional standards, and also a lot of the other things that play into that, like ADA conformance and compliance and that kind of thing. Burlington is an example of a school district that had a company come in. I think it was one that was also under state contract, and do an analysis of their buildings that looked at deferred maintenance and capital needs and ADA compliance and so on.
Mhm.
But what it didn't do, and it's excuse me, the gentleman from BGS also, Eric, alluded to, is the special needs that schools have. Do they have enough meeting rooms? So there's a lot of special ed needs and requirements now that that's a whole separate category of analysis that needs to take place. So
So you
there's a lot
do
there.
think that a consultant would be required to get the information that would be necessary or not? I just want to be clear about what you.
Yeah, I think a consultant is necessary. I don't think, like I said, I try to break it out. I think right now that construction aid should continue while this process is ongoing, because a lot of schools, they do know their requirements and are working to address them, and some of them can't get their bonds passed because of their poor communities, and they just really have a hard time. These things need to be addressed, and I think those things should go forward and should get construction aid. But as we look overall, if you're going to get a consultant in to do an analysis statewide, it's true in some cases they've already done this and the buildings are fixed up. They don't have a lot to do there. In other cases, they have a lot more to do. So but what you want to do is have a uniform analysis so you can understand what the issue is statewide.
Okay.
So if I could just paraphrase, Mr. Etkin, you're saying that you don't have a problem with spending money on a consultant. You just want a program to go forward for construction while that's happening.
Yeah, that's true. And I should mention, you say consultant, it's a consulting firm, because if you're going to do all the buildings in Vermont and want to get it done expeditiously, you need a larger firm that can get crews out to a lot of schools simultaneously. It would be more than, it won't be a consultant. It would be just clarifying that point a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other questions for Mr. Etkin before we pivot to the other topic, or for Eric Phil? Andrew.
I just want to ask Norm that he also sends us, he had a paper, or like maybe it's just a letter that he had on the idea on the ventilation system. And by talking to him, it seemed like, because schools know some of their issues, and some of the ventilation issues are very simple, just like getting the filter replaced or making sure it's facing the right way, that those are things that we could do quickly before the school happens. So I'm hoping we can have more conversations about that, and that Norm sends us not only his description of how to do the funding through the per pupil calculation, but also on how a program that would address all the schools' ventilation before August or September, how he sees that. That would be interesting.
I agree. Any thoughts you could send us on that, Mr. Etkin, would be appreciated. And again, the efficient path would be for the administration, whether it's through AOE or BGS or both, to be putting together some plan around ventilation that would not involve legislation, but we can help to coordinate that. So anything that you can send us, we'll try to get testimony and see where the administration is already. They may have gone down this path significantly without us knowing it. So.
Yeah, well, I think if there were to be, especially if there were to be some grant funds available to help schools get this ready in time, there would be a lot of schools that can be able to move forward and get significant work done between now and then, because there's a certain pent-up demand there, and a certain this is obviously an emergency. They need to make sure the schools are as safe as possible, and they would make things happen very quickly.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. I appreciate your testimony. We have your contact information, and we may well contact you further down the road on this. But that was great table setting today in terms of what in the House bill BGS likes and doesn't like, and what we should be thinking about beyond their framework in terms of other pressing needs. So we'll pivot to Ms. DeCarolis. Oh, Eric?
I just had a farewell statement. The reason that BGS does facilities condition assessments across all of its buildings is so that we can make rational decisions about where we're spending money on which structure when. If we have 6 boilers that are ready to blow up, which are the most important buildings? And I think you have a massive prioritization issue with all of these schools. It reminds me a little bit of town highway bridges, where some of them, right? Because the state doesn't necessarily own them, but we have a stake and we often get bled to repair them. And there are some that are structurally deficient, which means they could fall down. There are some that are functionally obsolete, which means you can't drive a semi through a covered bridge, but you might want to keep it just the same. And the way AOT did it was they inspected all of them and then made rational decisions and at times decided this historic thing has to go. We're going to replace this. We're going to fix this and plan it out. But you can't do that until you have a good baseline. So,
and of course, the big problem with bridges is what color to paint them, right?
oh, don't. I'm going to wear my Baruth Floor Team t-shirt next time.
All right. Thank you both. Feel free to stick around, but if you drop off, we will understand why. Ms. DeCarolis, good to have you with us. And were you able to understand from Jeannie's explanation what we're wondering about in terms of adult learning and standardized testing?
I think so. I mean, it was presented somewhat broadly, but my understanding is that there is the impression that adult education providers are being required to engage in in-person assessment.
Or, well, that they're being required to do assessment and that they have the option to do it remotely, but a number of them cannot because they don't have the technology. And so therefore it's a de facto mandate to do in-person testing. So the people who contacted us were wondering about waiving or extending the deadline. And so the first question would be, to what extent is it a federal mandate? And to what extent do we have control over it?
Okay, so I'll start with introducing myself for the record. I'm Jess DeCarolis. I'm Division Director at the Agency of Education. I oversee the Student Pathways Division, which is comprised of 6 teams, one of which is the Adult Education Learning Team. And also our division was tasked with the continuity of learning efforts and managing 4 sprint teams that are cross-divisional teams. So, I think there's a little bit of a conflation here. I think first, I guess I would want to tackle, because I believe this was in the email, that there was an assertion that if testing did not occur, that AEL providers would not be given their monies. And so just to sort of lay the table, adult education and literacy providers are grant funded, and they also run the high school completion program, which is a secondary program through the Flexible Pathways Initiative. So AEL providers receive approximately $4.5 million through state and federal funds for adult basic education. Adult education and literacy is dictated through AFLA, which is Title II, the Adult Education Family Literacy Act, which is Title II of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And they have to follow the federal requirements of the program. So it's a grant program. We write grant agreements, and then they're issued those funds based on those grant agreements. So there's no holding or withholding of funding to AEL providers as it pertains to AEL activities. The high school completion program is an education fund appropriation, as you're well aware of, and that is essentially AEL providers are identified as implementing the high school completion program to ensure coherence with the assigned high school's diploma graduation requirements. And really those are district monies that are paid to AEL providers as they execute activities. So there is nothing contingent upon standardized assessments for, you get paid to play. But you—
Well, if I could just clarify, so you say they get paid upon execution or completion of—
Yeah, so if they say they build like a PLP and they say part of the PLP is that we'll teach a science class. So obviously it's our responsibility to make sure that they've taught the science class, because we're using essentially, we've cut it off the top, but we're essentially using district monies because they're ed fund monies. And the AEL providers are nonprofits. They're not part of the public system. They are nonprofits who exist and say when they compete for the program, we have the capacity to deliver this program that we're competing for. And then we issue grants, but it's not, we haven't built a system in which the public is responsible for funding the existence of these, of a public entity. So, and it's hard, right? Because you're sort of doing both. And it's a little bit outside of the remit under the AFLA legislation. So right now, the guidance from OCTAE, which is the federal DOE office that oversees this, has said that the states will not be held accountable, like no decisions or penalties will be leveraged against states for failing to meet their negotiated performance indicators, understandably, right? So, but in no way, they have not unilaterally said you can waive all assessments. That being said, certainly what we have done is we're not dictating or requiring that people engage in assessment. However, it is very difficult to determine if a student has academically progressed if you can't assess them. So if at all possible, you would want folks to identify how learners are progressing during COVID. Same expectation for the K-12 system. We have waived, and the US DOE has waived the requirements for standardized assessment, but it doesn't mean that schools aren't assessing. I mean, they're engaging in formative assessments and performance assessments through different mechanisms.
So if I could just,
sure.
point this a little bit. So I'm looking at the email you referred to, I believe, and which Senator Hardy and I have seen forward to us from Senator Clarkson. And it says in its bullet points, it says many adult education students have finished all their requirements for a high school diploma, but will not be allowed to receive the diploma unless they perform at a certain level on standardized test, progress assessments by the end of June. In many cases, these tests can only be done in person at an adult education provider's office. Other adult education students are being asked/pressured to come into an adult education center to take standardized tests because the results have a direct impact on the adult education provider's funding stream. No test, no money for adult education providers. Is that not accurate?
It's not. So first is we transitioned to a new, by the way, as adult education and literacy providers, they are required by the federal government to engage in the national reporting system. There are federally mandated assessments. And in order to identify measurable skill gains, you have to engage with it. You don't get a choice. Obviously, with this particular scenario, they have relaxed some of those in the short term. But as far as how we will be assessed as a state, but that's set by the federal government. Because they're engaging in the high school completion program, one of the issues is that they are attempting to graduate students who are performing below NRS 5. So there are 6 levels in the national reporting system. NRS 1 is essentially operating at kindergarten, first grade level. So as part of a pilot, when we transitioned to the table 11-12 2 years ago, in which there was significant concern about the rigor of the assessment. In fact, actually, it was just better aligned to Common Core learning standards. There was a concern that students would drop levels. And what providers get paid for is they get paid for a graduation outcome. So this is probably where the conflation, where they're saying they're not going to get paid. The issue is that the guidance from OCTAE has been pretty clear that, and by the way, we're doing this K-12 system, that we're not requiring people to assess, but we're also not just blanket saying, oh, you're performing at the 6th grade level, but COVID happened, so we might as well just graduate you, right? Because as soon as you issue someone a diploma, what you're doing is you're preventing them from being able to access secondary education because they already have been issued a diploma. So if we know that there has been a significant depression on the ability to provide instruction, particularly if they're reporting that they can't online assess and they also can't perhaps provide instruction, our emphasis is on, just as we're saying with schools, just as it's happening across the nation and every other state when we're talking about positioning and pivoting to reopening, is that you want to provide additional learning opportunities, additional instruction. We might be providing instruction through summer programs in the summer. Octay has said, please do not exit folks unnecessarily. Just pivot and plan to provide instruction in the fall as we're thinking about reopening. So again, we have, by the way, just issued guidance today to schools and to providers about other mechanisms by which we could provide assessment, but the schools have to be involved. They're the ones issuing the diploma. And we do not want to diminish the value of a diploma by saying that someone has met those proficiency-based graduation requirements, but they're reading and writing at the 5th grade level. And we have individuals on these lists who are performing math at the 3rd and 4th grade level. And again, it is not to punish. It's simply saying, we're not just going to try to push kids out. And it really isn't about assessment. It's about the graduation outcome. So it's literally to give them the diploma.
Okay, so is it fair to say that this June 30th deadline, which is mentioned here, that there is not, if people don't take the tests in person by that date, there's no repercussions to their funding stream?
Only in so much as they have built their budgets around anticipating, and they put in the June 30th is the deadline they have set. When they create a plan, they say, we think this student is going to graduate by June 30th.
Yeah.
But that includes someone who, and I looked at the spreadsheets, students who they onboarded in January have received maybe 14 hours of instruction, and yet they're still anticipating that they're going to graduate June 30th, right? The whole concept is they are not going to be punished for not assessing, but we're not going to just give a blanket approval without some coordinated process, some alternate process in which they're working with the high school, right? Or that they're engaging in distance learning, which also they just received a draft to react to around how to do remote proctoring. But that's something we have to negotiate also with the test provider. I mean, you can't just, nobody would be allowed to do that for GRE, for EST, any of those things.
Okay, understood, I think. The last area that I wanted to think about was this long email that we got.
And I'm not sure, was I supposed to see that email? You're referring to it, but.
No, it was an email sent to us.
Okay.
But you mentioned that it seemed as though you might have read the same email, but.
No, it's just been an ongoing conversation for many years. It has nothing to do with COVID.
Okay, so so my other question has to do with these adult education providers. Apparently, one of the big stumbling blocks is they can't complete these tests online.
Yeah.
You know, they're technologically behind in that way. So my question is does the administration have some sort of plan to use this moment to push out COVID money to them, to bring them up to the standards so that all of the adult education providers by December would be able to do these things online?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I don't think I'm certainly in a position to speak to the administration, but we have crafted a proposal to provide, one proposal in which CARES funds could provide some relief to do exactly what you're proposing. I'd also say, though, that we've built in infrastructure monies, and particularly, again, into the high school completion program. For every student that they onboard, we give them $200 just for technology funds. And so if we know that the average retail of a Chromebook is $260, we have built that in for them to be investing. And again, I think all of us have experienced, I mean, let's be frank, that we may have been kicking the can on a lot of things when it comes to infrastructure, and now we're just sort of suffering the consequence of that. So they're certainly wrapped into that that orientation. They also were included in the scaling of Vermont Virtual Learning Cooperative. So they are also included in the free access to the online learning management systems, all of the coursework that's standards aligned, access to certified Vermont instructors, professional learning, et cetera. You know, I just actually was on a call with two of the provider executive directors prior to this, where we're talking about, you know, how can we revision the adult education system in a way in which they leverage each other's resources and expertise in a cooperative manner. Because I think historically it's been each provider has tried to solve a problem itself, as opposed to knowing that you're much more likely to solve a problem collectively because you can braid funding, you can merge, et cetera. So it's certainly on the radar. I will also say, though, that we changed our assessment policy with the transition to the new federal assessment 2 years ago to allow for online testing. Out of the 19 centers, only 2 have actually engaged in online assessment. So one of the challenges that they're experiencing right now is that because they have so heavily relied on paper assessments, the 2 tests, and as anybody who's taken an online assessment knows that there's an algorithm now. So when you answer a question, you're sent to another question. So the paper and online assessment don't actually match up. They have 2 separate matrices when it comes to their raw scores and their scaled scores. So the issue is that we haven't been able to transition to online assessment because we now have them having to, like, we have to actually modify and figure out the variability between the matrices, which then also means that in our data reporting system in which they input data, we have to actually do a programmatic change within the back end of that. So we've been working on that as well. And again, the reason we have to change that is because historically they were having trouble inputting their data correctly. So we had to build an algorithm into the data reporting system in order to accommodate that. So there's a little bit, again, of we're sort of suffering the consequence of our own behaviors.
Okay, and I'll leave it there. I just wanted to say that it seems like if we have 17 centers that are not working online, it seems like a very manageable, finite number that we could get technology to and bill maybe 100% of it to the federal government. So I understand building in the $200 into their existing contracts, but this would be an opportunity for a system-wide upgrade, it seems. So I'll just put that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think, though, that one of the biggest and this is across the education community, is not so much the centers having the infrastructure, which there are some needs, but we'd want to actually do a survey to get an accurate assessment of that. But it's the issue that we have individuals in homes that are prevented from that, right? So again, that's still that hard nut to crack because we're talking about a statewide approach to ensuring that there's equitable access to broadband.
But maybe each center has a fleet of iPads that they get because of the COVID emergency that they can lend out, and you can't get your diploma unless you bring it back. Questions from the committee for Ms. DeCarolis? Well, Senator Hardy.
Sorry, I just want to make sure, Jess, thanks for all of that. And it sounds like you've been working hard on so many things. So thank you. But I just want to make sure I'm clear. So they get their money when they graduate somebody. If they don't graduate somebody because they don't meet the standards, they're expected to continue to educate that person. And they would, in this fall, be able to continue to educate these people, whoever they are, they're students, and they wouldn't be punished for it. It just may take longer to get them to the finish line. Is that basically?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no more questions, thank you very much, Ms.
Thank
DeCarolis.
you all.
Good
Be
to
well.
have you here.
See you soon.
Committee, so that's our agenda for today. And I did want to give you a heads up that you may read about it or see it in some format, but apparently Adam Gresham went to House Ways and Means this morning and dropped a proposal indicating that the administration thinks it would be a good idea to require all districts to revote their budgets. Not the 19 that don't have one yet, but all of the districts that successfully voted a budget. They wanted to begin a discussion of requiring them to revote them. Seems like a very, very dumb idea to me, I have to say. And I was impolitic enough to say so, but you will hear about it. And along with that, you will probably hear at least one person has floated the idea, not a person that I consider serious in the policy arena, but floated the idea that the statewide healthcare bargaining should be overturned and they should be sent back to the bargaining table. So both of these things share the idea that because we now have an emergency, we should go back to things that were settled under statutory legal frameworks and simply overturn them because now we have a problem with the Ed Fund. I don't think that's the solution myself. So just a heads up to you as the committee, I would oppose both of those things. A requirement to revote budgets or an overturning of the collective bargaining agreement that was reached. I think those are, it's one thing if a district wants to revote their budget, they all have the ability to do that, but that's their local municipality in operation rather than us sending them back to do that. That doesn't solve the hole in the Ed Fund. That's my criticism of their solution to the hole in the Ed Fund. So that presumes that we're going to have another solution. I will say along those lines, I just read a news story before we gavelled in to our session today that the White House is now signaling they are open to the Democrats' proposals to add flexibility to the COVID money to allow backfilling holes in budgets as long as they can get, they're really concerned about liability for corporations in terms of COVID lawsuits. So whatever's going to happen at the federal level is going to happen, but I have still hope that they will allow us to use more of the money to fill revenue gaps as a result of the emergency. So any final, Corey?
I'll send you information as soon as I get it from Becca, Phil, but if I could get some time with the committee in the next week, even for a 15-minute long conversation about our little subcommittee that Tim put together on, kind of what went wrong, how could we do this better next time type stuff. So.
Okay, well, we don't have to limit it to 15 minutes. We can.
But I want to have that discussion, so I just wanted to get on your radar.
So this is the committee that you're on.
Right.
And that's different from Ruth's and
Yeah.
Debbie's? Okay, why don't next week I just put updates from both committees on the agenda?
Okay.
You can just let us know what you're doing and what your timelines are. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
and I think for ours, just having a discussion, and I can send out an email to the group this weekend. Becca's working on the language of what specifically we want to make sure we address. So once I get that, I can forward it to everyone to think about before we meet. But it's really just going to be collecting everyone's thoughts on, things that if we had to do, and when we have to do this all over again, how do we build a better model?
Yep.
What worked, what didn't.
And I don't want to end without kudos to Andy for his brilliant performance on the floor today, getting the third reading through of the healthcare bargaining bill.
At least now I'm prepared for next time. I spent all the time rereading all that stuff.
Yeah, not a peep from anybody. Okay, so thanks everybody. Jeannie, I will talk to you tomorrow about Tuesday's agenda. Sound good? Nope, can't hear you.
She's muted.
You looked like you thought it sounded good.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'll see y'all next week. Have a great long weekend.
I'd
Hopefully.
like to know who Senator Hardy's friends are in the chair behind her
Well,
there.
one of them is Miss Piggy, I think.
No, it's actually a hippopotamus.
Oh,
Kurt was there last week.
There's an elephant, there's a hippopotamus, there's a
Porcupine.
kangaroo, a rabbit, and there is a Vermont cow. It's a Holstein cow that says Vermont across it.
Wasn't Kermit there at one point?
Kermit was there.
Yeah.
There was another stuffed animal. They've kind of gotten thrown around the room. Every time
Porcupine.
kids come in
Isn't
here, they mess with them. So
it's not easy being green.
it's not.
I've asked Senator Ingram to indulge me by shooting a
Oh.
three-pointer.
Do it.
Oh, right.
On that
You
note.
too.
Good job.
Bye, everybody.